The wind screamed like a dying animal across the mountain pass. But inside the luxury ski resort, Mr. Crawford's voice cut through the chaos even louder than the storm. "Sit down, Miss Morgan." Nobody asked for the opinion of an unpaid volunteer. Hazel stood in the doorway, snow melting off her threadbare jacket, her hands calloused from working 3 jobs gripping the wooden frame. Behind her, the blizzard had turned the entire world into a white void. In front of her, 37 students huddled around the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate and nervously laughing about their adventure. 37. There should have been 38. "Sir, Sophia Moretti is not here," Hazel said, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her chest. "I counted 3 times. She is still out there." Mr. Crawford did not even look up from his phone. "Miss Moretti is probably at the private spa. Stop being dramatic and sit down before I report you for causing panic. I saw her leave before we evacuated. She was looking for phone signal near the tree line." "I said sit down." Crawford's face flushed red. "I have been teaching for 20 years. I know how to count students. Unlike you, I actually finished medical school instead of dropping out to pay off Mommy's hospital bills." A few students snickered. Hazel's jaw tightened, but she did not move. Outside, the temperature was dropping to 30 below zero. Every minute Sophia spent in that storm was a minute closer to death. Hazel looked at the emergency exit window behind the vending machines. Then she looked back at Crawford, who had already turned away to comfort a crying cheerleader whose phone had lost signal. The poor nurse made her choice. She grabbed her grandfather's old survival pack and walked toward the window. "Morgan, if you leave this building, you will be fired. I will make sure you never work in healthcare again." Hazel popped the emergency latch. The alarm shrieked, but it was nothing compared to the roar of wind that blasted through the opening. "Then fire me," Hazel said, and stepped into the whiteout. Behind her, in the warm safety of the resort, nobody knew that the quiet volunteer nurse had just walked into hell to save the only daughter of the most dangerous man on the East Coast. Nobody except the storm. And somewhere out there, freezing and lost, Sophia Moretti was about to discover that her father's mafia empire was not the only thing standing between her and death. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good survival tale, and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Because in 30 below zero, the only thing colder than the storm is the choice between safety and doing what is right. In the middle of the bus, far from both the noisy group of students in the back and the empty seats in the front, Sophia Moretti sat alone by the window. Her black leather jacket made of real custom-tailored hide was placed on the seat beside her like an invisible wall separating her from the rest of the world. Her ink-black hair was tied up high to reveal the small diamond earrings her father had given her for her birthday last year. Her sea-blue eyes, inherited from her mother, were fixed on her phone screen as she typed a message to her father saying, "I arrived safely, Dad. I miss you." A few seconds later, the reply appeared saying, "I miss you too, Princess. Call me when you get to the resort. Be careful." Sophia smiled softly, her first smile of the entire day. Her father was the man the whole city feared, but to her he was just Dad. The man who had read her fairy tales at night when she was little, who had held her when she cried because she missed her mother. Who would do anything to make her happy, even allowing her to go on this ski trip, though he did not want to. A group of girls passed her seat, whispering loudly enough for her to hear every word. "That is Sophia Moretti, Vincent Moretti's daughter. I heard he is mafia. He kills without mercy. Are you not afraid? What if you sit near her and her father thinks you did something to his daughter?" There was giggling. Then they passed by as if she did not exist. Sophia tightened her grip on her phone, her nails digging into her palm. She was used to this. 16 years of living in her father's shadow, and she had never had a real friend. People either feared her or wanted to use her, or both. No one saw Sophia. They only saw Vincent Moretti's daughter. The bus jolted as it hit a pothole. A backpack fell from the luggage rack, spilling its contents into the aisle in front of Sophia. She bent down to help by instinct, and her hand touched an old worn notebook with a frayed leather cover and yellowed pages. Hazel appeared beside her, hurriedly gathering her things, saying, Sorry, this is mine," with a note of panic in her voice. Sophia looked at the notebook in her hand and curiously opened the first page and read aloud. "Survival notebook. The mountains and forests do not care how much money you have in your pocket. Are you a special forces soldier or something?" Hazel stopped and looked at her in surprise. No one had ever spoken to her in such purely curious tones before. Without fear, without contempt, only curiosity, Hazel answered softly that it belonged to her grandfather and that he had been a mountain infantry veteran. Sophia asked with her blue eyes lighting up, "Did he really teach you how to survive in the wild like in the movies?" Hazel laughed lightly for the first time all day and said it was not glamorous like in the movies. Mostly it was learning how to read the weather, find clean water, keep your body warm. Boring things that could save your life. Sophia looked at Hazel, really looked at her for the first time. Not someone flattering her because of her father, not a fake teacher or a frightened student. Just a woman with calloused hands and an old notebook. Sophia suddenly asked, "Could you teach me a few things? I want to know how to survive." Hazel looked at the girl and saw something familiar in those blue eyes. Loneliness. The longing to be seen as herself. Something Hazel had lived with for 27 years. The first lesson is always observe what is around you. The sky, the wind, the clouds. Nature always tells you what is coming if you know how to listen. Sophia looked out the window where the snow was beginning to fall more thickly and asked, like now, "The snow is falling heavier." Hazel followed her gaze with a flicker of worry in her amber eyes and said, "Yes, like now." Mr. Crawford passed by and saw them sitting together and said, "Miss Morgan, I think I told you not to bother the students." Sophia frowned and said coldly, "She is not bothering me. I invited her to sit." Crawford blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by a student, especially this one. He forced a smile and walked away without another word. Sophia turned back to Hazel with a mischievous smile and said, "See, sometimes having a scary father is useful." Hazel laughed for real, the first laugh she had had in months, and said, "You are different from what people say about you." Sophia tilted her head and asked, "What do people say about me?" Hazel answered that they say you are dangerous, that you are cold, that people should stay away from you. Sophia was silent for a moment, then shrugged and said, "Maybe I am like that. But you are still sitting here." Hazel looked at her and saw herself in her and said, "I am also someone people should avoid." Sophia said then, "We suit each other." For the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone. Outside the window, the snow fell thicker and thicker. None of them knew that this brief conversation would become the thread tying two fates together in the coming storm. At the same time, hundreds of miles to the east, Vincent Moretti was sitting in his penthouse office on the top floor of Moretti Tower, the glass wall revealing the entire city skyline, where his empire spread like a giant octopus, with tentacles reaching into every corner, real estate, casinos, restaurants, and the shadow deals no one dared to mention. Vincent Moretti, 36 years old, the boss of the Moretti family, the man known as the Ghost, because no one had ever seen him act and live to tell the story. Sitting behind a black oak desk in a custom-tailored gray suit, fitted to his 1.85 tall frame, his cold, steel gray eyes scanning the numbers on his laptop screen, while Marco, his right hand, stood across from him, reporting on a business operation in the south, though Vincent was only listening halfway, because the other half of his mind was on a bus in the mountains of Colorado, where his daughter was on her way to a ski resort, and his phone vibrated with a message from Sophia saying, "I arrived safely, Dad. I miss you." And the corner of Vincent's mouth lifted slightly. A movement so small, Marco almost missed it. But Marco had followed him for 11 years, long enough to know that it was a smile, something as rare as rain in the desert. And Vincent typed back, "I miss you too, Princess. Call me when you get to the resort. Be careful." And he set the phone down but kept his eyes on the screen for a few more seconds. Princess, that was what Maria had called Sophia when she was alive. And Vincent closed his eyes as memory surged like a tide. Maria lying on a hospital bed, her golden hair already dull, her sea-blue eyes fading. She had fought for 36 hours to give birth to Sophia, but her body could not endure it. Postpartum hemorrhage. The doctors could not save her. "Take care of our little princess," Maria whispered, her hand gripping his with her last strength. "Tell her mother loves her, and do not let your darkness swallow her. Vincent, she deserves to live in the light." Those were his wife's last words, and Vincent had held the newborn in his arms, Maria's blood still wet on his sleeve. And he had sworn to protect Sophia with his life, sworn to let no one touch her, sworn to build an empire strong enough that no one would dare look at his daughter with bad intentions. 16 years. He had kept that vow for 16 years, and Marco's voice pulled him back to the present, saying, "Boss, did you hear me?" And Vincent opened his eyes, the gray returning to its usual coldness. "The southern operation, I heard you. Proceed as planned." And Marco nodded but did not leave. He looked at Vincent with hesitation and said, "She will be fine. Our two best guards are with her." "I know, but you are still worried." And Vincent did not answer. He stood and walked to the glass wall, looking down at the city below. He had built everything he had to protect Sophia, but today, for the first time in 16 years, she was beyond his reach. "She wants to be normal," Vincent said quietly. "She wants to go out with her friends like other children. She hates feeling caged in a golden cage." "She is like her mother," Marco said softly. Maria also hated being overprotected. and Vincent closed his eyes. Yes, Sophia was like Maria in every detail. The blue eyes, the stubbornness, the longing for freedom, and that made him love her and fear for her at the same time. Because he had lost Maria, he could not lose Sophia, and his phone vibrated again with a message from the bodyguard saying, "Arrived at the resort safely. Weather is getting worse but still under control." And Vincent nodded and set the phone down and returned to his work, not knowing that in a few hours the next message from Colorado would shatter his world, not knowing that weather under control would become a white hell, and not knowing that his daughter's life would rest in the hands of a woman he had never met, a poor nurse with calloused hands and a heart braver than any warrior in his empire. The storm arrived without warning. One moment before the sky was only gray with gentle falling snow, and the next it was as if someone had overturned a gigantic glass jar, and the world outside became a screaming curtain of white, and Hazel was the first to realize it because she was sitting beside Sophia explaining how to read the direction of the wind through the movement of the trees when she looked out the window and her heart nearly stopped. This was not normal snowfall. This was a blizzard, the kind her grandfather had called the White Fury, the kind that killed people within minutes if they did not find shelter. And the driver realized it too, and tried to keep the wheel steady, but the wind was pushing the bus out of its lane, and visibility dropped to almost nothing, and everything outside became a thick, milky white, and Mr. Crawford stood up with a trembling voice telling the students to stay seated, and that everything was fine, and the driver knew how to handle it. But everything was not fine, and Hazel felt it before it happened because the bus began to slide. Not fast, but slowly and smoothly, as if it were dancing with the ice. And the driver hit the brakes, but the wheels could not grip the road because physics did not care about human effort. And Hazel shouted, "Hold on!" and Sophia, "Duck!" and "Cover your head!" as Sophia barely obeyed, before the bus tilted to one side, and the right wheels slipped off the road into the soft snowbank, and the whole bus tipped at a 45-degree angle. And luggage rained down and students screamed and glass shattered and metal ground against metal with a piercing sound, and then everything stopped, and there was a suffocating silence, broken only by the howling wind outside and the ragged breathing of 38 people inside. And Hazel was the first to move and ignored the pain in her left shoulder and the taste of blood in her mouth, and stood up gripping the seat rails to balance on the tilted floor, and began checking each student. And she turned back to Sophia asking if she was all right, and Sophia nodded, shaking, and said she was fine. And Hazel told her to stay seated and not move until she returned. And Hazel continued down the bus, and most of the students were only shocked with small cuts from broken glass and nothing serious. But near the back, her heart tightened, because Sophia's two bodyguards, the men Hazel had noticed from the beginning despite their attempt to appear uninvolved, were lying motionless, one unconscious with blood flowing from a head wound, and the other groaning with his right leg bent at an unnatural angle, an open fracture. And a student asked if he could help, and Hazel saw he was one of the few who had not giggled when Crawford humiliated her earlier, and asked his name. And he said Marcus and Hazel told him to find anything that could be used as a splint, wood slats, rolled magazines, anything hard and straight, quickly. And Marcus ran off, and Hazel knelt beside the unconscious guard and checked his pulse and pupils, and saw he was alive with a serious head injury. And she tore her jacket to use the cloth to stop the bleeding, and asked if anyone had a clean cloth, and students threw towels to her, and even the rich children she had. I thought only knew how to look down on others now acted when needed. And Mr. Crawford appeared pale, asking what they should do, and Hazel did not look at him, because she was fixing the broken leg with the wood Marcus brought, and paracord from her backpack, and told him to call for help, and he said there was no signal, and Hazel clenched her jaw because of course in the mountains in a blizzard there was no signal, and she said, "Then we need to get to the resort," and stood, and looked out the window, and through the white curtain could faintly see the shape of buildings in the distance about 2 miles north, and said if we follow the main road we can reach it. And Crawford almost shouted that 2 miles in this weather was madness. And Hazel turned to him with amber eyes, cold as ice, and said, "If we stay here we will die," because the engine was still running and half the bus was buried in snow. And if the exhaust got blocked, carbon monoxide would kill them, before the storm did. And she looked around at the faces of 38 frightened students and teachers waiting for her, a volunteer nurse they had despised all trip, and said, "We evacuate now." And with that Hazel Morgan, the woman no one had looked at, became the only guide for 38 lives in the middle of the White Fury. The evacuation was hell. Hazel led the group using her compass and her instincts to navigate through the white curtain of snow. Behind her, 36 students and Mr. Crawford formed a long line, holding hands and taking heavy steps through snow up to their knees. 2 of the strongest students carried the unconscious bodyguard on a makeshift stretcher made from bus seats. The guard with the broken leg was supported by Marcus and another boy, and every step drew a groan, swallowed by the wind. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees, and was still falling, and Hazel felt the cold bite into every cell of her body, cutting through her thin jacket, as if it were not there. But she did not stop, and she could not stop because 36 lives depended on her. 1 hour. 1 hour of walking through the white hell. And when the lights of the resort finally appeared through the snow, Hazel almost cried with relief and led them into the main lobby, where the staff were waiting with warm blankets and hot drinks after receiving a distress signal from driver's radio. The students poured inside like an exhausted river collapsing onto chairs, the floor, anywhere they could sit. And Mr. Crawford ran to the front desk shouting for rescue for the 2 injured guards. And Hazel stood by the door counting each person who passed. 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, and she waited, and no one else came through. 37, and Hazel's heart pounded, and she counted again, scanning every face in the lobby. Once, twice, 3 times, 37, 1 was missing. Sophia, and Hazel looked around wildly. The black hair, the blue eyes, the leather jacket. None, no Sophia anywhere. And she ran to the nearest group of students asking where Sophia Moretti was, and if they had seen her. And they shook their heads, and a blonde girl shrugged, and said she saw her get off the bus early before the evacuation, and that she seemed to be looking for a phone signal. And Hazel's heart was squeezed tight because Sophia had gotten off the bus before the evacuation and gone out alone as the storm began. And Hazel ran for the main doors, ignoring the staff shouting for her to stop. And outside the storm was still screaming, but Hazel did not look at the storm. She looked at the snow, and she saw them. Footprints, small footprints, almost covered by fresh snow but still visible. And they did not go toward the resort. They went toward the forest edge, toward the mountains, toward the white death waiting. And Sophia had gone the wrong way, and was out there alone, in a -30-degree storm, without survival gear, and with no one knowing where she was. And Hazel looked back at the resort where Mr. Crawford was on the phone, and the students were drinking hot chocolate and beginning to forget the nightmare. And Hazel knew what she should do. Go inside and report and let the adults handle it and let the professionals search. But she also knew the truth. Every minute passing was a minute. Sophia was closer to death, and rescue would take hours. And in this weather, Sophia did not have hours. She might only have minutes. And Hazel tightened her grip on her grandfather's survival backpack she had not let go of all trip, and stepped back into the resort not to rest, but to face Mr. Crawford one last time before making the decision of her life. Hazel stepped into the white hell, and the hell greeted her with a slap of -30-degree wind, pain, slicing through her skin, through her bones, through her very soul. But she did not stop, and she could not stop, because somewhere in this white curtain a 16-year-old girl was slowly dying, and Hazel lowered her head and shielded her face from the icy needles lashing her skin like whips. As she searched again for Sophia's footprints, the small dents in the snow that were being erased by the storm. And she had to hurry because every second that passed the traces grew fainter, and Sophia drew closer to death. And she began to walk, then to run, then to walk again when the snow reached her knees and made running impossible. And her body, already weakened by months of hunger and overwork, protested every step. But Hazel was used to forcing her body beyond its limits because she had done that for 27 years. And her grandfather had taught her how to read tracks in the wild. And Sophia's footprints showed panic, uneven steps, occasional stumbles, then rising again. And Sophia had tried to find her way back, but in a blizzard every direction looked the same, and she had walked in circles without knowing it. The classic mistake of the lost. And Hazel adjusted her course, trying to guess where Sophia would go next. And time passed like a never-ending nightmare. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and Hazel could no longer feel her fingers, and her thin gloves were not enough against this brutal cold, and her body began to shake uncontrollably. The first sign of hypothermia, but she kept going, and remembered her grandfather's words that when the body wants to quit, let the mind lead, because the body can endure more than it thinks if you do not let it convince you that it cannot. And Hazel repeated those words in her head like a chant. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And Sophia's footprints grew fainter until they almost vanished under new snow. And Hazel knelt and brushed the snow away with her bare hands to find them. And her skin burned when it touched the ice, but she did not care, and she found a faint, hollow, then another, and Sophia had gone this way toward the spruce forest. And Hazel stood and continued, but her legs began not to obey, and she stumbled and fell face first into the snow, and the cold wrapped around her like a lethal blanket, whispering to her to lie down and rest just a minute. No, Hazel growled, forcing herself up. She could not die here, not today, not while Sophia was still out there. and she staggered on using the trees for support, and her vision began to blur. Whether from snow or her body giving up, she did not know. And she blinked hard, trying to focus, and then she saw it, a patch of red in the white world, and Hazel lunged toward it with her heart hammering. And when she reached it, she saw what it was. Sophia's scarf, the deep red cashmere scarf she had worn on the bus, snagged on a low branch, fluttering in the wind like a desperate flag. And Hazel pulled it free and pressed it to her chest, and the fabric was still a little warm, or perhaps that was only the illusion of a freezing body. But what mattered was that Sophia had been here recently. Very recently. She is here, Hazel whispered, her breath turning instantly into white clouds torn away by the wind. Sophia is near. And Hazel looked around for more signs and saw them, fresher, clearer footprints leading toward a giant old spruce about 50 meters away. And the tracks ended at the base of the tree and went no farther. And Sophia had stopped there, and she was still there. And Hazel ran, or rather tried to run on legs that were almost numb, and every step was a battle with her own body. But she did not give up, and she was almost there, and she was about to find Sophia, and only a few more steps, and do not fall, and keep moving. And the great spruce filled her vision. Its branches spread wide like a natural shelter, and beneath it, curled into a small ball, was a human shape, black hair, leather jacket. Sophia. Hazel rushed to Sophia's side, and her knees struck the hard snow, but she felt no pain. The girl was curled beneath the spruce like a small animal trying to keep the last of its warmth. Sophia's lips were blue, her skin waxed pale, her eyelids half closed, showing a frightening milky rim. She did not move. Sophia. Hazel gently shook her shoulder, her voice trembling with cold and fear. Sophia, can you hear me? There was no response. Hazel pulled off her gloves and placed 2 fingers on Sophia's neck, searching for a pulse, and for the first seconds she felt nothing, and her heart nearly stopped. Then she felt it. A weak, slow beat, but it was there. Sophia was alive. Severe hypothermia. Hazel's medical knowledge analyzed automatically. Her core temperature was likely below 32 degrees, stage 2 or 3. Without warming, she would die within an hour, maybe less. And Hazel acted on instinct shaped by medical training and her grandfather's survival lessons. She opened her backpack and pulled out the thin, emergency foil blanket and wrapped Sophia in it carefully not to jolt her, because a weak heart could stop if shocked. Wake up, sweetheart. Hazel patted Sophia's cheek, gently trying to stimulate a response. Sophia, can you hear me? This is Miss Morgan. I came to save you. A small groan escaped Sophia's blue lips, and her eyelids fluttered, trying to open as if something heavy were pressing on them. Hazel exhaled in relief, and tears spilled and froze on her cheeks. She was responsive, barely conscious, but responsive. That was good. That was hope. She could be saved. Sea cold, Sophia whispered like a voice from another world. Dad. Daddy. I know you're cold. Hazel held Sophia to her chest, using her own dwindling body heat to warm her. I'll get you out of here. You'll see your father again, I promise. But as she said it, Hazel knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. She looked around, and the storm was still screaming, and visibility was almost nothing, and the temperature kept falling, and she could not carry Sophia 2 miles in this weather, and her own body was nearly spent, and her legs shook, uncontrollably, and if she tried to move, both of them would die on the way. She needed shelter now. Hazel's mind spun for a solution, and she remembered her grandfather's lesson. If you cannot find shelter, build one. A quinsy, a snow shelter. She had read about it hundreds of times in his notebook, and practiced building one as a child during winters on her grandparents' farm. She knew how, but building one large enough for 2 took at least 2 hours of heavy labor, and in her condition that might kill her. But if she did not build it, they would both die within an hour. Hazel looked down at Sophia, trembling and murmuring her father's name, and remembered her promise. You'll see your father again. I promise. And Hazel Morgan was not someone who broke promises. She laid Sophia down gently, making sure she was wrapped tightly in the emergency blanket, and leaned against the tree to shield her from the wind. And then Hazel stood and took out the small folding shovel from her survival pack and began digging snow. Wait here a moment, Sophia, she whispered, not knowing if the girl could hear her. I'll build us a home. Hazel dug, and she dug as if her life depended on every stroke, because it did. Her life and Sophia's. The tiny folding shovel clawed at the frozen snow 1 stroke at a time, maddeningly slow but unable to go faster. This snow was not soft powder but wind, packed into layers, hard as white concrete, and every stroke demanded all the strength left in Hazel's exhausted body. The first step was to build a large mound. That was what her grandfather had taught her, and Hazel shoveled snow from around her into a pile, about 1.5 meters high and about 2 meters wide, and packed it down so it would bond and not collapse when hollowed. a task that would normally take two healthy people in normal conditions, but Hazel did it alone in a -30-degree blizzard with a body nearly out of energy. 30 minutes passed and the mound was large enough, and Hazel stuck small branches into it, each about 30 centimeters long. Another lesson from her grandfather, so she would know when to stop digging, because when the tips appeared inside the wall was thin enough. The second step was to wait for the snow to harden, but Hazel had no time to wait because Sophia was dying by the tree. So she took the risk and began to dig from the side, making a small tunnel into the mound. The hardest part because she had to lie flat and crawl into the narrow tunnel and scrape snow out with her bare hands when the shovel could not reach. Her gloves were soaked and frozen, stiff like wood, so she pulled them off and threw them aside. And from that moment, she dug with bare hands, and the cold bit into her skin like thousands of knives. But she did not stop, and she could not stop. 1 hour. Hazel dug for 1 hour in the white hell, and her fingernails broke, and the skin of her hands cracked and bled, and dark red drops fell on the white snow like tragic petals. And she felt no pain anymore, and felt nothing anymore except one thought ringing in her head like a bell. Keep digging, keep digging, keep digging. And the inner chamber of the Quincy slowly took shape. A small space, just big enough for 2 people to curl up with a ceiling about 1 meter high. And Hazel dug a shallow trench in the floor, so cold air would sink and keep the sleeping platform warmer. And she made a small vent hole in the roof to prevent suffocation, and every detail followed exactly what her grandfather had taught, because every detail could be the difference between life and death. And finally the Quincy was finished, and Hazel crawled out, her body shaking uncontrollably. And she looked at her hands and almost did not recognize them. Blood had frozen into dark patches on cracked skin, and broken nails exposed raw flesh beneath. And she felt no pain. She felt nothing. A bad sign. Severe frostbite. But she had no time to worry about herself because Sophia was still lying by the tree, wrapped in the emergency blanket, motionless like an ice statue. And Hazel dragged herself to the girl, and every step was a battle with her surrendering body. And she checked Sophia's pulse, and it was still there. Weaker than before, but there. And Hazel whispered, "Sophia, can you hear me? I will take you. Somewhere warm. Hold on." And she slid her arms under Sophia's shoulders, trying to lift her. But her body had no strength, and her arms shook and her knees buckled, and she fell into the snow with Sophia in her arms. "Stand up," Hazel ordered herself. "Stand up, you useless thing. The child is dying. Stand up." And she clenched her teeth and poured every last piece of will into her legs. And she stood and dragged Sophia, not carried her but dragged her, step by step toward the Quincy. 5 meters, 10 meters, 15 meters, each meter a lifetime. And at last she reached the entrance and pushed Sophia inside, and then crawled in after her. And inside the Quincy, the wind no longer screamed, and the sound was swallowed by snow into a strange silence like another world. And the temperature was still cold, about -5 degrees, but compared to -30 outside, it was heaven. And Hazel used her last strength to block the entrance with her backpack and packed snow. And then she lay down beside Sophia and pulled the emergency blanket over both of them, and held the girl to her chest to give whatever warmth remained. In her freezing body, "We'll be all right," she whispered into Sophia's ear, not knowing if she was speaking to the girl or to herself. "We'll survive, I promise." And outside the storm kept howling, but inside the small snow shelter, 2 people from 2 different worlds lay in each other's arms, fighting death with the only weapon they had left, the warmth of life. Time passed in the snow shelter like a thick, slow river, and Hazel did not know how long it had been. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. She only knew she had to keep Sophia awake because hypothermia had a dangerous trick. It lulled its victims into sleep, made them feel falsely warm and drowsy, and then let them slip into a final sleep. And she could not let Sophia sleep. "Sophia, can you hear me?" Hazel gently shook the girl in her arms. "You need to stay awake. You need to talk to me." And Sophia groaned softly, and her eyelids fluttered open, her sea blue eyes now dull and exhausted but still holding a spark of life. "Miss Morgan," she whispered. "Where am I?" In a snow shelter, Hazel tried to smile, though her lips were cracked and aching. "I built us a house, not as fancy as your mansion but warmer than outside." And Sophia looked around and her eyes slowly focused as she took in the small space lit by pale blue light, filtering through the snow walls. "You built this. Alone?" And Hazel nodded. "My grandfather taught me. Do you remember the notebook on the bus? It has instructions for building a Quincy." And Sophia was silent for a moment, and then tears began to roll down her cheeks and freeze in the cold air. "Why?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Why did you do all this? You do not know who I am. You do not know who my father is. You could die for me, because you are a human being." Hazel answered simply, because no one deserves to die alone in a blizzard, and Sophia began to cry out loud, small sobs echoing in the tight space. She cried not only from fear and cold, but because for the first time in her life someone had seen her as a person, not as Vincent Moretti's daughter, not as a mafia princess, just as a 16-year-old girl who needed saving. And Hazel said gently but firmly, "You need to talk, to stay awake. Tell me about you, about your life." And Sophia took a shaky breath and said she did not know where to start. Her life was very lonely. "Lonely," Hazel repeated. "You are the daughter of one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. You can have anything you want." And Sophia gave a bitter smile that did not belong on a young face and said, that was the problem. She could have anything except what she wanted most. Real friends. People either feared her father or wanted to use him, and no one saw her. They only saw Vincent Moretti's daughter, and Hazel listened in silence, seeing the strange mirror between their fates. And Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger as memories spilled out like a broken dam. She once had a friend in 6th grade named Lily, and she thought Lily truly liked her until she discovered Lily's father was trying to approach her father for a business deal. And Lily had only befriended her because she was told to, and after that she trusted no one. And Sophia looked at Hazel with painful blue eyes and asked if she knew that feeling. Not knowing who was real and who was fake, when every smile might be a lie, and Hazel whispered that she knew very well. And Sophia asked her to tell her about her life, and Hazel hesitated because she was not used to sharing, and had buried her pain under years of silence and endurance. But in this snow shelter on the edge between life and death, those walls seemed meaningless. And Hazel said she once wanted to be a doctor and studied well and had a scholarship to medical school, and in her 3rd year her mother got cancer, and Hazel stopped to swallow the pain still fresh after years. She left school to care for her and worked 3 jobs to pay hospital bills, but it was not enough, and her mother died with $200,000 of debt that Hazel inherited. And Sophia took Hazel's hand, her small frozen hand full of empathy, and asked if there was more. And Hazel smiled sadly and said she married a man she thought was kind named Derek, who turned out to be violent and addicted to gambling, and who borrowed $50,000 in her name, and beat her when she found out. And Hazel touched the scar on her chin from that last night and said she escaped, but he was still looking for her and wanted the money. And Sophia asked gently if that was why she took this trip to run from him. And Hazel nodded and said partly, and because she had nowhere else to go, because her apartment was about to be taken, and she could not pay next month's rent, and the possible trip gave her 3 days of shelter and free food. And they lay in silence for a while, holding each other, sharing warmth and pain. And Sophia finally said they were the same, both lonely and both treated unfairly by the world. But Hazel still walked into the blizzard to save her. And Hazel whispered that sometimes the most broken people understood best the value of being saved, that she could not save her mother and could not save herself from Derek, but she could save Sophia. And Sophia held Hazel tighter, as if afraid she would disappear, and said when they got out she would tell her father about Hazel, and that her father would help her because he owed Hazel her life. And Hazel shook her head and said she did not do it for reward. But Sophia said firmly that Hazel deserved to be rewarded and deserved happiness and a better life, and that she would make sure of it. And Hazel said nothing and only held the girl closer. And outside the storm still howled, but inside the small snow shelter 2 lonely souls had found each other. At the same time, hundreds of miles to the east, Vincent Moretti was sitting in a meeting room with 3 senior members of the organization when Marco's phone vibrated, and Vincent did not notice at first, because he was focused on the contract in front of him, a real estate deal worth $20 million. But when Marco stood up with a face as pale as a corpse, Vincent knew something was wrong because Marco never went pale, and in 11 years at Vincent's side, he had seen things that would drive ordinary men insane, and remained calm. So for Marco to go pale, it had to be something serious, very serious. And Marco swallowed and said for the first time with a trembling voice, "Boss, something happened." Sophia, and Vincent stood so fast his chair flew back and hit the wall with a crash, and he said, "Speak." And Marco said the bus was in an accident in the blizzard. The students were evacuated safely to the resort, but Sophia was not among them. She is missing. And the world stopped, and Vincent felt as if the air had been pulled from the room, and he could not breathe or think, and only heard blood roaring in his ears, and one word echoing in his mind, "Sophia, Sophia, Sophia." And he asked where the bodyguards were, and his voice was ice, but those who knew him could hear the fury beneath. And Marco said they were injured in the rollover, one unconscious and one with a broken leg, and they could not protect her. And Vincent closed his eyes and clenched his fists, until his nails cut into his palms and drew blood. But he felt nothing, because the only pain was in his chest, where his heart was being crushed by a fear he had not known since the night. Maria died, His daughter was out there alone in a blizzard. And he opened his eyes, now burning, and ordered prepare the helicopter and assemble a search team of 20 fully equipped within 1 hour. And Marco said the weather was terrible and the helicopter might not fly. And Vincent roared that he did not care. And if the helicopter could not fly, they would drive. And if they could not drive, they would walk. And if they had to crawl, they would crawl because his daughter was out there and he would bring her back at any cost. And Marco ran out, and Vincent stood alone in the meeting room, staring into the black night, where somewhere hundreds of miles away, his daughter was fighting death, and he could do nothing but wait. And waiting was what Vincent Moretti hated, most because he was a man of action who had built his empire. By never waiting, and always staying one step ahead of his enemies, and now he was powerless. And his phone vibrated with Crawford's number, and Vincent answered coldly, and told him to explain exactly what happened. And Crawford stammered about the accident, and the evacuation, and Sophia getting off the bus early to look for a signal, and not knowing she was missing until they reached the resort. And Vincent cut him off and asked who went to look for his daughter, and Crawford said a volunteer nurse named Hazel Morgan, who went on her own even though he tried to stop her. And Vincent's voice turned dangerous, and asked if he tried to stop her. And Crawford said he thought she was overreacting, and that Sophia was somewhere in the resort and he did not know. And Vincent repeated, "You did not know," in a calm so frightening it silenced him, and said that after he found his daughter, he and Crawford would have a conversation, and Crawford would not like it. And Vincent hung up and told Marco, who had returned to find everything on Hazel Morgan within 15 minutes. And 12 minutes later, Marco brought a file saying, Hazel Morgan, 27 years old, former medical student who left in her 3rd year to care for her mother with cancer. Mother died, leaving $200,000 in debt. Married Derek Morgan and divorced after 2 years for domestic violence. Ex-husband hunting her for $50,000 in loan shark debt. Currently working 3 jobs and living in an apartment about to be repossessed. Joined the trip as an unpaid volunteer nurse. And Vincent read every line and saw a woman who had lost everything and had nothing to gain by saving Sophia, and was walking into a frozen hell simply because it was the right thing to do. And in Vincent's world, such people did not exist, because kindness did not exist, only profit and calculation. But Hazel Morgan was proving him wrong, and he asked if she had any chance to survive. And Marco said in this weather alone, without professional gear, it was very low, and Vincent crushed the file in his hand, as if trying to crush his helplessness, and ordered to move because the convoy was ready. And he walked out with his coat flaring behind him like dark wings, knowing only this, that if Hazel Morgan saved Sophia, he would owe her his life. And Vincent Moretti always paid his debts. Inside the snow shelter, the night passed like a never-ending nightmare, and Hazel did not know when she drifted off because her body had gone beyond its limits long ago, and now it was collecting its debt, and she felt herself sinking deeper into a dark, warm place, where there was no pain, no cold, no worry. And part of her knew this was dangerous, because the warmth of freezing was an illusion, a trap of death, but she was too tired to fight, and too tired to do anything but let go. And then she saw her grandfather sitting by a campfire, his wrinkled face lit by the flickering flames, and his kind eyes looking at her with familiar tenderness. And Hazel knew this was the forest behind her grandparents' farm, where she had spent the happiest summers of her childhood. "Grandpa," she whispered with tears on her cheeks, "I miss you so much." And he smiled and waved her closer, and said he missed her too, but asked why she was there, because it was not yet her time. And Hazel cried that she was so tired and could not go on, and that she had tried her best and saved the girl and wanted to rest. And her grandfather shook his head and told her she was not finished because she had saved the girl from death but had not yet taught her how to live, and had given her hope but not yet shown her that hope could become real. And if Hazel died now, the girl would think Hazel died because of her and would never forgive herself, and would carry that guilt for life. And Hazel was silent as his words cut through the fog in her mind, and she remembered he was right, and he asked if she remembered what he taught her about real strength. And Hazel whispered that it was not to protect oneself, but to protect those who could not protect themselves. And he said that now the girl needed Hazel to protect her from the pain of losing Hazel, and that Hazel needed to live not for herself but for the girl and for those who needed her and for the life she deserved. And Hazel cried that she was too tired and had no strength left. And he stood and touched her cheek with a hand warmer than any dream, and told her she had survived 27 years of hell and loss, and betrayal and violence and poverty, and had walked into a -30-degree storm to save a stranger, and that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and now she had to prove it by waking up and living. And the fire faded, and his image dissolved into darkness, but his voice stayed in her mind, saying, "Wake up, live, wake up, live." And then another voice broke through the fog, younger, closer, frightened, "Miss Morgan, please wake up." And Sophia had woken in the night, and her body had warmed from the shelter in Hazel's heat. But when she looked at Hazel, she froze, because Hazel was no longer shivering. Her skin was pale as snow. Her lips were blue, her breath barely there, her hands bruised and cracked with dark, dried blood. And Sophia knew from what Hazel had taught her that when shivering stopped, the body had given up trying to warm itself, and that meant death. And Sophia shook her head, crying no, and pulled off her leather jacket, and covered Hazel with it, and pressed her own body close to Hazel, trying to give whatever warmth she had, and begged her not to die, because she had saved her, and she had not even thanked her or shown her that life could be better. And Hazel had promised to take her back to her father, and Hazel Morgan was not someone who broke promises. And Sophia kept talking and holding her, and sharing her warmth, and speaking of her father, and the life she wanted, and what she would do when they got out, to keep hope alive and keep Hazel with her. And somewhere in the darkness, on the thin edge between life and death, Hazel heard her and heard the plea and remembered her grandfather's words, and she fought. She fought the darkness pulling her down and the cold freezing her soul. And she fought for Sophia, for the promise, for the life she had not yet lived. Dawn came like a miracle. One moment before the world was still a screaming hell of wind and snow, and the next silence fell like a great blanket, and the storm was gone. And Sophia opened her eyes, not knowing when she had fallen asleep. Holding Hazel, and the pale blue light through the quinsy walls had turned into warm golden orange, the light of sunrise, and she crawled out of the shelter, squinting at the blinding sun reflecting off the pure white snow. And the world outside was breathtakingly beautiful, as if the storm had never happened. The sky clear and blue without a single cloud, snow blanketing everything and sparkling like millions of diamonds. Absolute silence, the kind only found in the wildest places. But Sophia had no time to admire it, and she turned back to the shelter where Hazel still lay, unmoving, her skin as white as the surrounding snow. She was alive because Sophia had checked her pulse before crawling out, but it was so weak it was barely there. And Hazel was fading, and Sophia could do nothing but scream for help. "Help," she cried, her broken voice echoing through the silent mountains. "Is anyone there? Please help us." And there was no answer but her own voice, returning from distant peaks, and she did not give up, and kept shouting until her throat burned, and her voice was only a hoarse whisper. She screamed for Hazel, for the woman who had risked her life for her, for the promise she had made to herself that Hazel would not die, that she could not die. And then she heard it. An engine, far away but coming closer, and Sophia looked up, her heart racing, and a black dot appeared on the horizon, and grew and grew. A helicopter, and not just one but 2, 3, a whole team flying toward her bearing the familiar emblem she had seen all her life, the crest of the Moretti family. "Dad," Sophia cried, tears pouring down. "He is here," and she jumped and waved wildly, though she knew they could not hear her, but they saw her. And the lead helicopter descended toward a nearby clearing, and before it touched down, a figure leaped out, and Vincent Moretti ran across the snow like a wolf caring about nothing but his daughter, and he crushed her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe, but she did not complain, and sobbed against his chest, feeling warmth and safety she had thought she would never feel again. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. He never showed anyone. I am sorry I did not protect you and was not with you." Dad, Sophia sobbed. "Her, Miss Morgan, she saved me. She is dying, you have to save her." And Vincent released his daughter and followed her gaze to the small snow shelter, a few meters away, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. And inside, a still form lay. And he ran and knelt beside Hazel, the woman from the file Marco gave him last night, former medical student, daughter of a single mother now gone, victim of a violent marriage, a woman with nothing and no one and no reason to risk her life for his daughter, but she had. And Vincent saw Hazel's hands bruised and cracked with dark, dried blood, and knew she had dug the shelter with bare hands, and sacrificed her body so his daughter could live, and he checked her pulse weak. But there, medical Vincent shouted with the authority of a man used to commanding hundreds, "Get her on the helicopter now." And the medical team rushed in with a stretcher and equipment, and wrapped Hazel in thermal blankets and lifted her carefully. And Sophia ran beside them, holding Hazel's hand, and would not let go, and asked if Hazel would live, and said she had to live, because she was the best person she had ever met. And Vincent looked at his daughter then, at the woman on the stretcher, and he did not know if Hazel Morgan would live or die, and he could not promise, but he knew one thing. "She will live," he said with fierce resolve. "I will make sure of it, no matter what it takes." Hazel woke in a room she didn't recognize. A pure white ceiling rose high above her with crystal chandeliers glittering softly. Pale cream walls were decorated with expensive art. Fresh flowers were everywhere, and a faint, gentle fragrance filled the air. The most advanced medical equipment lined the space beside her bed, monitors showing heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. This wasn't the public hospital where she had stayed with her mother. This was something entirely different, something she had never seen, let alone experienced. She tried to sit up, but her body refused. Every muscle ached as if she'd been beaten with sticks. Her hands were carefully bandaged in white gauze from wrist to fingertips. She remembered them cracked and bleeding as she dug the snow shelter. Then she remembered the cold. Then she remembered Sophia. She jolted and tried to rise again. And someone caught her. A joyful, relieved voice cried that Miss Morgan was awake, and that she should tell her father. Hazel turned and saw Sophia beside the bed, her blue eyes bright. Her face no longer pale as that night, but warm with color. She was alive. Hazel breathed out with tears she didn't mean to shed, and asked if Sophia was all right. Sophia took her hand carefully around the bandages and said she was, because Hazel had saved her. Then the door opened and a man entered. Hazel's breath caught because she had never seen anyone like him. Tall, broad-shouldered, carved like stone, with slightly curled dark hair and sharp Italian features in a custom gray suit like modern armor. But what was most frightening were his eyes, gray and cold as steel, sharp as a blade. The eyes of a man who had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. Eyes with no room for weakness. Vincent Moretti. Hazel didn't need an introduction. She knew who he was. Sophia's father. The Mafia Boss the whole city feared. The most dangerous man on the East Coast. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Sophia stood and said proudly that this was Miss Morgan, the one who had saved her. Vincent said nothing. He stepped closer, his gray eyes never leaving Hazel. He stopped at the foot of the bed and studied her in a heavy silence that made Hazel want to look away. But she didn't. She had faced death. She didn't fear a mafia boss. She was Hazel Morgan. Finally, he spoke in a low, emotionless voice and said yes. Hazel answered calmly, though her heart pounded. He said she had saved his daughter's life. Hazel said she had only done what needed to be done. Vincent tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle, and said he had already read every line of her file, every shadow she tried to hide. He mentioned that he knew the crushing weight she had been carrying alone, from the hospital bills to the man she was running from. He looked at her bandaged hands and remarked that someone with her history usually focuses on survival, not saving others. She wasn't surprised that he knew everything. He said she didn't know who his daughter was or who he was and had nothing to gain, so why? Hazel looked straight into his eyes and said because it was what needed to be done. Vincent said no one did anything without motive, and that in his world kindness didn't exist, only profit and calculation. He asked what she wanted: money, protection, a place in his organization. Hazel laughed, tired but real, and asked if he thought she had walked into a -30-degree blizzard, dug a shelter with bare hands, and nearly died of hypothermia just for a place in a mafia organization. She shook her head and said she wanted nothing, that she would do the same for anyone, that she had been taught so, that she didn't need a reason to do what was right. Vincent was silent. Something in his eyes changed. He said she wasn't afraid of him. Hazel said she had faced death, and a mafia boss wasn't more frightening than -30 degrees. For the first time, Vincent laughed. A real brief laugh that softened his face. Sophia stared at him in wonder because she had never seen her father laugh like that. Vincent said Hazel Morgan was interesting. He said he didn't understand her, but he respected her, and that he owed her a debt he would pay whether she wanted it or not. Vincent pulled a chair to Hazel's bedside and sat down. For the first time, he placed himself on her level, instead of standing above her like a boss, looking down at a subordinate. He said in a low, measured voice that in his world there was an unbreakable rule. Anyone who saved the life of someone from the Moretti family would be rewarded accordingly. She had saved his daughter, the most precious thing he had in this world, so she should say what she wanted and he would provide it. Hazel repeated that she wanted nothing, her voice tired but firm. She had already told him she hadn't done it for a reward. Vincent shook his head, his gray eyes holding something close to irritation. Everyone wanted something. Money, power, protection, opportunity. Everyone had a price. She only had to say it and he would grant it. Hazel gave a small, weary smile, the smile of someone long used to having nothing, and told him he didn't understand. She had lived her whole life with nothing and was used to it. She didn't even know how to want things from others. All she wanted was to go home, rest, and forget all this. Vincent studied her in silence for a long moment. He had met thousands of people, from the most ruthless bosses to the most despicable traitors. He knew how to read them. He knew when they lied, when they hid, when they calculated. But the woman before him had nothing to hide. She was telling the truth. That left him unsure how to respond. He finally stood and nodded once and told her to rest and that they would talk later, and he left the room. Sophia stayed behind until the door closed. Then she turned to Hazel with determined eyes and said she needed to tell her something and that she would tell her father everything. About her situation, about Derek, about the debts, about the apartment, about everything. Hazel shook her head and tried to sit up but was still too weak, and told Sophia no. She didn't need to do that. It was her problem and she would handle it herself. Sophia asked how, her tone sharper than usual. Would she go back to an apartment about to be taken? Would she keep working 3 jobs while Derek still hunted her? Would she keep living like that until she died of exhaustion? Hazel had no answer and fell silent. Sophia began to cry and said Hazel had saved her life when no one else cared and had nearly died for her. And now when she had the chance to help Hazel, she was being told not to and that it wasn't fair. Hazel whispered that she didn't need fairness. Sophia only needed to live well, and that was enough for her. But Sophia said it wasn't enough for her and wiped her tears and stood and said she would tell her father and Hazel couldn't stop her. Before Hazel could object, Sophia had already run out. In the hallway, Vincent was waiting, his back against the wall, gray eyes watching his daughter because he knew she would come and he knew she would speak. Sophia stopped in front of him and said he needed to know about Miss Morgan, everything. Vincent told her to speak. Sophia stopped in front of him and said that the papers in his office didn't tell him who Hazel Morgan truly was. She spoke about the pain in Hazel's voice when she talked about her mother's last days, a story that wasn't written in any report. She told him about Derek, not just as a name on a page, but as the shadow of fear that Hazel fought, even while keeping Sophia warm in the snow. Sophia pleaded with her father, explaining that Hazel didn't want a reward. She just wanted a life where she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She looked at Vincent and said that Hazel had given her everything, and now it was their turn to be the ones who didn't let her fall. Vincent listened, his eyes darkening with each detail. When Sophia finished, he was silent for a long moment. Sophia said Hazel didn't want his help and said she would handle it herself, but she couldn't. She had been trying alone for years, and this was where she had ended up. She deserved help and a better life. Vincent placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder and squeezed gently and said he knew, and he would take care of it. When Sophia said Hazel didn't want it, Vincent cut her off and said she didn't need to know, because some debts didn't require the receiver's consent to be paid. He turned to Marco at the end of the hall and told him to find Derek Morgan, because he wanted to see him. When Marco asked what he would do, Vincent said he would decide after seeing his face. Then he ordered that Hazel Morgan's hospital and loan shark debts be paid off completely, with no trace left, and that he wanted to know the status of her apartment. Marco nodded and disappeared. Sophia thanked her father. Vincent didn't answer. He stood there, looking toward the door of Hazel's room. At a woman he didn't know who had risked her life to save his daughter without asking for anything. A kind of person that didn't exist in his world. But she was here, and Vincent Moretti would make sure that from now on she would never have to face the darkness alone again. 1 week later, Hazel was discharged from the hospital, and she refused every offer Vincent made for her to stay longer, for a driver to take her home, for anything else, because she only wanted to return to her ordinary life, no matter how poor or lonely it was, since it was hers, and the only thing she had. And the taxi dropped her in front of the old building where she had lived for the past 2 years, and Hazel stood on the sidewalk looking up at the 3rd-floor window of her apartment, and her heart sank because the window was wide, open, the curtains were gone, and inside was dark and empty. And she ran up the stairs, ignoring the broken elevator she was used to, running 3 flights with her heart pounding, and when she reached her door, she stopped because there was a new lock and a notice taped to it saying, the apartment had been repossessed due to non-payment of rent for 3 months, and all belongings had been moved to storage. And Hazel stood there staring at the paper, unable to believe it, because she knew she owed rent and knew this could happen, but she thought she had time and thought she could manage, and she was wrong. And she slid down to sit in front of the door with her back against the wall and her head on her knees, not crying because she had no tears left, just sitting there with the only thing she still owned, her grandfather's survival backpack, wondering where she would go now because she had no home, no money, and no one. And she heard footsteps on the stairs but didn't look up and didn't care who it was. Maybe the building manager, maybe a curious neighbor, maybe Derek had finally found her. And then a familiar low voice said it looked like she needed a place to stay. And Hazel looked up in shock to see Vincent Moretti standing there in his black suit, like a shadow in the shabby hallway, his gray eyes on her with an expression she still couldn't read. And she asked what he was doing there, and he said simply that he knew everything, that her apartment had been taken and she had nowhere to go, and that he had an offer. And Hazel stood up, leaning on the wall because her body was still weak, and said she had told him she didn't want anything from him. And Vincent stepped closer and said this wasn't about what she wanted, but about what he needed, that Sophia needed someone to take care of her. Not a nanny or a bodyguard, but someone she trusted, someone who could protect her if needed, someone she truly connected with. And Hazel looked at him in confusion, and he said, Sophia talked about her all week and saw her like a sister, like the only real friend she ever had, that Sophia trusted her, and he trusted her because she had proven she was willing to die for his daughter. And Hazel shook her head and said she wasn't a bodyguard. She was just an unemployed nurse. And Vincent cut her off and said no, she was the woman who saved his daughter with her bare hands in a -30-degree blizzard, who dug a snow shelter until her hands bled, who nearly died to keep his child warm. And she was more than a bodyguard. And Hazel was silent. And then Vincent took an envelope from his coat and handed it to her, saying in return she would have an apartment in the Moretti family complex, a monthly salary enough to live comfortably. And Hazel opened the envelope with trembling hands, and inside were documents, receipts showing the $200,000 hospital debt paid in full, the $50,000 loan shark debt paid in full, and a restraining order against Derek Morgan approved by the court. And Hazel whispered, asking what he had done, and Vincent said calmly that he had paid his debt. And when Hazel asked about Derek, he said, Derek was alive but understood very clearly that if he came near her again, he wouldn't be alive. And Hazel didn't ask how and didn't want to know, only knowing that for the first time in years, she didn't have to look over her shoulder or flinch at every knock, that she was free. And she asked why he did all this, and Vincent said because she deserved it, because she had given everything she had to save a stranger and deserved someone to do the same for her. And Hazel cried as all the pain and exhaustion and loneliness she had buried for years finally poured out, and Vincent waited without judgment or hurry, and Hazel finally said this wasn't the life she knew, and Vincent said her old life had almost killed her, and that she should try a new one. And Hazel looked at him, at the envelope, at the locked door behind her, thought of Sophia, thought of herself and her empty future, and then she nodded and said quietly but firmly that she would try. 3 months passed like a dream Hazel didn't dare believe was real. She had moved into an apartment in the Moretti complex, a place that was clean, warm, safe, and fully equipped with comforts she'd never dared to imagine. Every morning, she still had to pinch herself to be sure it wasn't an illusion. Her work was simple but meaningful. She took care of Sophia, took her to school, taught her the survival skills her grandfather had taught her, and listened as the girl talked about school, friends, and the worries of being 16. Sophia was no longer the lonely girl sitting alone on the bus. She had friends now, laughed more, and had begun to trust others. What surprised Hazel most was her relationship with Vincent. At first, they kept their distance. Vincent was the employer, and Hazel the employee. They met at dinner with polite conversation about Sophia and work, and nothing more. But gradually the dinners grew longer and the conversations deeper. Vincent began to ask about Hazel's life, about her grandfather, about the dreams she had given up. Hazel began to see another Vincent. Not the cold mafia boss the city feared, but a single father doing his best to raise his daughter. A man carrying the weight of an empire while still making time every night to ask Sophia about homework and school. A man who had lost his wife before his daughter had even opened her eyes and had carried everything alone for 16 years. Hazel didn't know when her feelings began. Maybe it was when Vincent waited for her outside the hospital corridor when she had a cold. Maybe when he brought her a cup of hot tea while she read late in the library. Maybe in the way his gray eyes looked at her. No longer cold as on the first day, but warmer and softer. She didn't dare name the feeling or think about it. He was Vincent Moretti, the mafia boss. She was only a poor nurse he had taken in. The distance between them was like heaven and earth. Yet whenever he was near her, her heart beat faster. Whenever he smiled, and he only smiled with Sophia and with her, it felt as if the sun had risen. She knew it was dangerous. She knew she shouldn't let herself fall into this. But she couldn't stop it. Far away, in a dark suburban villa, Luca Benedetti sat in shadow studying secretly taken photographs of Vincent with Sophia and a strange woman. Of that woman living in the Moretti complex. Of Vincent looking at her with a gaze Luca had never seen in 11 years of watching his enemy. Luca smiled, a cruel smile that never reached his cold eyes, and ordered his man to find out everything about her. Her name, her background, her connection to Moretti. The man vanished into the night. A week later, a report lay on Luca's desk. Hazel Morgan, 27 years old, former medical student. The woman who saved Sophia Moretti in the blizzard 3 months earlier, now living in the Moretti complex as Sophia's caretaker. Luca's smile widened as he read that she wasn't a bodyguard or one of Moretti's people, but just an ordinary nurse who had accidentally stepped into their world. An easy target. He stood and looked out into the night and said they would take her alive because he wanted Moretti to suffer before he killed him, and the best way to make a man suffer was to take away what he loved most. That morning began like any other ordinary day. Hazel woke early, prepared breakfast for Sophia, took her to school, then stopped by the market to buy fresh food for dinner. She liked shopping alone. She liked the ordinary feeling of choosing vegetables, bargaining with the vendors, blending into the crowd like any other normal woman. This was the life she'd never had before, and she treasured every small moment of it. She didn't notice the shadows watching her from a distance. She didn't notice the black van parked at the corner that had followed her for 3 days. She didn't realize her peaceful life was about to be torn apart again. When she stepped into the shortcut alley back to the Moretti complex, they attacked. Fast, silent, professional. One hand clamped over her mouth from behind while 2 others pinned her arms and legs. Hazel struggled and tried to scream, but her cry was swallowed by the cloth soaked in chloroform pressed to her face. The world blurred and spun, and then fell into darkness. When she woke, she was sitting on a wooden chair with her hands tied behind her back and her legs bound to the chair legs. The room around her was dark and damp, with the smell of sewage and decay. An abandoned warehouse, perhaps on the edge of the city. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face lit by the single dim yellow bulb in the room. He was about 40, with salt and pepper hair, cold reptilian eyes, and a cruel smile. Hazel knew he wasn't ordinary. He had the same eyes she'd seen in Vincent, the eyes of someone who had seen too much darkness and become part of it. He asked gently if she knew who she was, calling her a pawn in the game of powerful men. Hazel swallowed, her throat dry, but didn't let fear show. She'd been afraid too many times in her life and had survived them all. She told him calmly that she knew who she was, and the question was whether he knew what he was facing. He laughed and said she was just a poor nurse and asked if she thought Moretti cared about her or would save her, that she was just a useful pawn he'd picked up and would throw away when he didn't need her anymore. Hazel looked straight into his eyes and said she'd survived -30 degrees, had dug a snow shelter with bare hands until they bled, had faced death and walked through it, and asked if he thought a dark room and some ropes could frighten her. Luca Benedetti stopped laughing. He looked at her with new interest and said she was more interesting than he'd thought, but that whether she was afraid or not, Moretti would come, and when he did, Luca would kill him slowly and painfully as Vincent had killed his family. At that same moment, Vincent was in his office when Marco burst in, pale, and said Hazel had been taken. Vincent's world collapsed with that one name. He stood so fast the chair crashed behind him, but he didn't hear it. All he heard was blood roaring in his ears, and her name echoing in his head. Hazel, Hazel, Hazel. He asked who with a voice cold as ice, though his hands were shaking for the first time in his life. Marco said Benedetti, Luca Benedetti, that he'd sent a message and wanted to meet alone or Hazel would die. Vincent stood there feeling rage burn in his chest, and beneath it something else he'd denied for 3 months. Fear, not of Benedetti or death, but of losing her. Of never seeing her amber eyes again. Of never hearing her laugh when Sophia told a story. Of never sitting across from her at dinner just to be near her. In that moment, Vincent Moretti realized the truth he'd buried, that he loved her. He didn't know when it had begun, but he knew he wouldn't lose her, even if he had to burn the world. He ordered his men to prepare everything and said they would bring her back and Benedetti would pay for touching what was his. Night fell as Vincent's convoy stopped 200 meters from the abandoned warehouse, 20 men fully armed and ready. But Vincent didn't wait for them and stepped out first. His gray eyes cold as steel in the dark, his movements steady and certain like a wolf on the hunt. And Marco ran after him, trying to stop him, and said the men should go in first because Benedetti might have traps. But Vincent didn't stop and said she was in there, and every second he stayed outside was another second she was in danger. And he drew his gun and checked the magazine and walked toward the warehouse, while behind him, the 20 men spread out silently to surround the building, and the assault was fast and brutal, with gunshots tearing through the night, glass shattering, screams, bodies hitting concrete, and Benedetti's men were many, but they hadn't expected Moretti to arrive so fast, or to lead the assault himself. And they didn't understand that this wasn't business or a gang war to him, but something personal, and Vincent stormed the warehouse like a hurricane, his gun roaring, no hesitation, no mercy, every bullet a death sentence for those who dared touch her. And he found Hazel in the back room still tied to the chair but unafraid, and her amber eyes lit up when she saw him, not with relief or gratitude, but with something deeper and warmer that Vincent didn't dare name. And he asked if she was all right as he knelt to cut her bonds, his voice shaking despite his control. And she said she was fine, and that he had come. And Vincent looked at her with emotions he could no longer hide, and whispered that he would always come, even if he had to walk through hell. and a shot rang out behind them, and Vincent turned instinctively to shield Hazel, but the bullet only grazed his shoulder, tearing his suit and drawing blood, and Luca Benedetti stood in the doorway with a gun and a face twisted by hatred, and shouted that Moretti had taken everything from him and killed his family, and now would die. And Vincent stood slowly, pushing Hazel behind him, and said Benedetti's family had killed his father first, and everything that followed was the consequence of that choice. And Luca laughed madly and aimed at Hazel, saying she was also a consequence, and that he would take from Vincent what he loved most. And Vincent moved faster than thought, and in a blink Luca's gun was on the floor, and he was on his knees with his arm twisted behind him at an unnatural angle, and bone cracked, and Luca screamed, and Vincent said in a voice so cold it froze the air, that Luca had dared touch her and look at her, and think of harming her, and he tightened his grip, and Luca screamed again, and begged him to kill him, and Vincent said death was too easy, and that Luca would live in prison with the memory of failure and the knowledge he'd never touch him or anyone he cared about again. And he signaled Marco to take Luca to the police, and the room fell silent, with only Vincent and Hazel standing amid the wreckage, and Hazel said his shoulder was bleeding and stepped close, and he said it was just a scratch and didn't move when she touched it with the hands of a former medical student. And they stood so close, their breath mingled, and Vincent said he'd been afraid when he heard she was taken, and that he'd never been so afraid, even when Maria died or his father died, and that he was afraid of losing her. And Hazel asked why, and he said because he loved her and didn't know when or why, but couldn't breathe at the thought of losing her, and that she had entered his life like a storm and changed everything. And Hazel said she didn't deserve him because she was only a poor nurse, and he cut her off saying she was the bravest person he'd ever met, and the one who made him believe there was still light in a dark world, and that if she allowed it, he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving that. And Hazel cried not from pain but from finally seeing light after too long in darkness, and said she loved him too, and was afraid to love him and afraid to trust happiness, but didn't want to be afraid anymore, and wanted to be with him. And Vincent held her tight, and she held him back with her head against his chest, listening to his heart, and they stood like that in the ruined warehouse with sirens in the distance, while for them the world had disappeared and only two souls remained who had found each other through snow and shadow. 1 year later, the snow fell again on the Colorado mountains, but this time Hazel wasn't facing it alone. She stood on the balcony of the resort, where a year earlier she had walked into the storm to save a stranger, and looked out at the pure white landscape, stretching to the horizon, while Vincent stood behind her with his arms around her waist, his warmth chasing away the winter cold, and Hazel whispered that it was beautiful, and Vincent replied that it wasn't as beautiful as she was, and she felt his smile against her hair. And Sophia ran over, pulling at both of them with bright, eager eyes, saying they should go skiing, and that she wanted Hazel to teach her how to build a quinzee, and they spent the whole morning on the slopes, Sophia learning quickly and gliding down with the confidence of someone who had already faced the greatest fear of her life, while Vincent, the terrifying mafia boss the city feared, kept falling as he tried to keep up with his daughter, and was teased mercilessly by both Hazel and Sophia laughed that he thought he was good at everything, and Vincent brushed snow off his coat and said no one was good at everything, not even mafia bosses. And Hazel laughed, her clear laughter echoing through the quiet mountains, thinking this was the life she'd never dared to dream of. A family, love, happiness, things once as distant as the stars now within reach. And that afternoon Vincent took Hazel to a special place, and she recognized it immediately. The old spruce tree, where she had found Sophia a year earlier, where she had built the snow shelter with her bare hands, where two lonely souls had found each other in the storm. And though the snow was long gone, the memories remained, and Hazel touched the rough bark, remembering the longest night of her life, the night she thought she would die and instead found a reason to live. And Vincent said this was where she had saved his daughter, and where she had proven that even in his dark world there was still light, and that she had walked into an icy hell to save a stranger, and had shown him that kindness still existed, and had changed his life. And he knelt on the snow and took a black velvet box from his coat, and Hazel covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes, and he asked Hazel Morgan if she, who had walked into an icy hell for a stranger, would walk into his hell and stay forever. And Hazel laughed through her tears, and said his hell was her heaven. And he slid the diamond ring onto her finger and stood and held her, and they kissed beneath the spruce tree, where a year earlier they had died and been reborn. And from a distance Sophia stood beside Marco, smiling brightly, and said finally, and that her father had taken 3 months to realize he loved Hazel and 9 more to propose, and she thought she'd have to wait until she was old. And Marco laughed and said the boss was never good at romance, but Sophia said confidently that Hazel would teach him, because she had taught her how to survive in the snow, and teaching him how to love would probably be easier. And against the evening sky 2 figures became one, the poor nurse and the mafia boss. The woman with nothing to lose and the man with everything to protect. They had found each other in the storm, and now they would face every storm ahead together. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come from where you expect it, and sometimes it comes from a stranger willing to walk into hell for you, and sometimes hell turns out to be the road to heaven. And the story of Hazel and Vincent isn't only a love story, but a story of courage, sacrifice, and faith that there are still people in this world willing to do what's right, even if it costs them their lives. A reminder that sometimes the quietest people are the strongest, the loneliest people have the warmest hearts, and salvation can come from the places we least expect. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe so you don't miss more emotional stories. Please like and share this video with those you love. Tell us how this story made you feel, and whether it reminded you of anything in your own life in the comments below, because we'd love to hear from your heart. Thank you for staying with us through this story, and we wish you and your family good health, peace, joy, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.